The book that I'm looking at right now is called Living on the Border of Disorder, written by Cherry Boone O'Neill and Dan O'Neill. I'm sure many of you in our listening audience recognize at least the name Cherry Boone from being the daughter of Pat Boone. She lived a good part of her life on TV and on stage. I remember being a young person about the same age as she is, watching her on some of those TV specials. So she was very familiar to me. I don't know how many people know the fact that Cherry Boone suffered for many years during her adolescence, during her teen years, with anorexia nervosa and then bulimia, into the early stages of her marriage. What this new book out by she and her husband is about, basically, it's not only about the suffering person, the victim of anorexia nervosa or bulimia, but it's about the people who have to live with that person, who are part of the family, who are part of the support unit around that person, what they can do to be helpful, and quite frankly, what they have done or what they do that is harmful to the person going through this. And my special guest today is Cherry Boone O'Neill. And Cherry, thank you for being with me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
I hope I did a correct thumbnail synopsis of the book. I read through it, and I guess I was actually a little amazed. I don't spend a whole lot of time trying to put myself into a category of who I am or what I am. I did have a friend several years ago who suffered from bulimia, and it was really rather amazing now in retrospective to read your book and to have to categorize myself in that person's life. It's rather scary. And, while it opens your eyes and you say, okay, well, if I ever run into this again, I'm going to know better what to do, it also kind of makes you feel like, well, boy, I don't want to harm the person.
Right.
Heaven only knows. Maybe it'd be better if I just stepped back from the whole situation.
Well, we certainly had to learn the hard way through long years of experience. There was really very little, slim to nothing, known about eating disorders when I was going through this, because I'm now 38 years old, and I first had my major plunge in weight when I was age 16 going on to 17. So there was not much known about eating disorders at all when I was going through this. So not only was I battling an unknown enemy, certainly the people around me were dealing with something that they didn't understand either. And we all were struggling to do the best we could with what little we knew. And fortunately, somehow or another, we kind of intuitively wove our way through the maze of what to do and what not to do, and I was able to come out relatively unscathed on the other end of things. But a lot of people aren't as fortunate. So the purpose of this book is, as you say, to try and guide some of the people that are living on the border of someone else's disorder, how they can weather the damage and the devastation that is done in the life of the person who is ill, but also in their own lives as that person, that sufferer's life is shaken up from whatever disorder they might be suffering with.
I don't know that people realize that it's not only the victim of the disorder that suffers, but it really is the people on the outside. You feel guilty. You feel like you're not being a good enough friend, parent, family member. You feel like, heaven forbid, you ought to be able to control that person. You ought to be able to put that person, if nothing else, in an isolated chamber and either force them to eat or force them not to eat, or at least force them to do what you think would help that person get better because you care about that person.
Right. Your motives might be perfectly pure, but the idea that any one person can control another person is totally false, and that's one of the hardest lessons someone has to learn in trying to deal with someone who has an obsessive-compulsive disorder or addictive behavior. You cannot control that other person's choices or behavior. Ultimately, they will do what they will do, and in the meantime, the role that you play can either be helpful or harmful, both to yourself and to the other person involved.
I think the first question that a lot of people, that comes to mind for a lot of people is, how can a good Christian person raised in a good Christian family have this kind of, quote, sin in their life, unquote?
Well, that was one of the things that we dealt with in this book, is the fact that so often when someone has an obsessive-compulsive disorder or an addiction of some kind, much of the Christian world looks at it as simply sin. And what we try to explain in this book is that it really isn't simply sin, that many times there are a myriad of other factors that enter in that are beyond that person's ability to really control, such as biochemistry. Perhaps that person is undergoing a biochemically caused depression that is altering their ability to make choices properly. Perhaps that person's genetics are predisposing them towards a mood disorder of some kind, and certainly we have no control over that. Plus, most of the time, someone with this kind of a problem is merely trying to deal with a trauma or a stress or pain in their life, and they have chosen a maladaptive response to be able to do that. They're trying to deal with the pain in their lives, but in doing so, they're creating ultimately a problem that's bigger than the one they're trying to deal with. And so to simply call it sin, I think is not only not fair, it's just not true. There are many other issues that come to play in a person's life that cause them to do the things they do and make the choices they make. And one of the things we try to deal with in this book is opening the minds of certainly other Christian people to what's going on in the life of that other person that they care about, so that they can try to be a little bit more empathetic or compassionate or understanding, and be able to separate the person's behavior from that person, so that that person isn't dealing with judgment on top of whatever other problem they're dealing with, but rather they're receiving nurturing and support from the people that love them and care about them.
And we're not just talking about eating disorders here.
Right.
We're talking about a vast myriad of disorders that are addictive and could really range from drug abuse,
right,
from people who get involved in, from the simplest thing as diet pills or amphetamines or whatever, all the way to certain types of sexual abuse,
right,
and sexual addictions.
Right.
All of these are disorders that people can get involved in, not out of sin in their life, but out of, a wide variety of psychological problems.
Right, exactly. And in the Christian world particularly, we've been so afraid to talk about anything that starts with the prefix psych.
Yes.
Psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, any of those things we've tended to shy away from. And I have certainly benefited from seeing a psychiatrist and being involved in psychotherapy in my own life. That was really the crossroads for me, because my problem was not just physical. It was not just, that there was some spiritual needs that I needed to tend to. Certainly prayer played a role. My choices were involved in some of the things that went on in my life. And I think that, to simply narrow it to the spiritual or the emotional is not accurate, because in my situation it was psychotherapy that really was the crossroads or the turning point whereby I was able to start to come out of my disorder and make responsible choices again, and kind of dig myself out of this pit that I had found myself in that was impossible for me to get out of by myself.
Anybody who has any type of a disorder needs a person within the Christian church to admit to having a disorder of any type. Have we become a little better at being acceptive and supportive, or are we still a very rigid group of people?
Well, I would hope that we've become a little bit more accepting and supportive of those that are suffering in our midst. But I think there certainly is a reticence on the part of people who have any kind of disorder in their lives to be upfront and honest about it, because there is a history, track record of receiving judgment. And anytime someone is hurting to the point where they have, created this maladaptive way of dealing with life, the last thing they're going to want is to be hurt anymore by receiving judgment from people that they care about and would really appreciate the approval from, or the acceptance from. And so to try and open people's minds to the idea that you can accept and love the individual without condoning the behavior, and in trying to understand what's causing that person's behavior, offer support and nurturing and acceptance, that is going to be, in the long term, what's going to help that person much more than any kind of judgment or, preaching or trying to, to apply biblical verses to that person's problem. Those things might actually be applicable, but in this person's life, that's not what they really need at that point. What they really need is the love and support and acceptance of the people that they care about, not to the point of ignoring the fact that that person's choices and that person's behavior are devastating or detrimental or certainly self-destructive, but to try and help that person to realize that they're valuable and that the choices that they are making are not only not wise, that they're unnecessary and that they can change them. That we have to take a different approach. We can't just come at them with judgment. We need to come at them with nurturing and support and compassion.
The people around the person who is leading a very disordered lifestyle, they realize that there's a problem. Does the person who has this disorder realize it's a disorder?
Sometimes they do, but probably more often they don't. Certainly in the initial stages of a disorder, there tends to be a denial factor involved. Certainly with anorexia, that's the case. When it gets into bulimia, it's a little bit harder to deny that your behavior isn't, is somehow bizarre or wrong or out of the norm. With other types of things, with drug abuse or alcoholism, again, there can be an initial stage of denial. So very often the people on the border will recognize the fact that a person has a problem before the disordered individual can see that fact themselves.
I'm standing on the border of somebody who has a serious problem, and I really want to reach out to that person. And the reaction that I get from that person is not only one of denial, but is one of hostility, anger, sometimes bitterness, and there's a real lashing out. How is that person feeling?
Defensive. They're feeling afraid that this world that they have, this kind of protective that they have created for themselves as their means of dealing with the pain in their lives is now being attacked by someone, and therefore their whatever stability, albeit unhealthy, they have created for themselves is now being threatened with destruction. There is a reason why that person might be hostile or not be willing to receive what a loved one is saying to them. It's not that they're trying to necessarily be hostile. It's that they're afraid.
We've all read the horror stories about people who have literally starved themselves to death,
right?
Have ended up in the hospital, drug overdoses. My initial reaction would probably be a very incorrect reaction. My initial reaction would be one of terror first, and then an immediate need to do something for this person before this person ended up a statistic on a gravestone.
Right. Well, and in certain situations, an emergency approach might be necessary. Certainly a parent who has a child who is, kind of walking the tightrope between life and death in terms of, their weight being so low that it's life-threatening, that parent certainly, it's understandable for them to have that child, that minor in their home, hospitalized. But there's really very little that people can do for someone unless they want to be helped. You can put somebody in the hospital, but an adult, someone other than a child, can just check themselves right out again. The person who is ill has to want to get better.
Can the person want to get better, but still not be able to deal with that desire to get better?
Oh, yes. Yes, there is a great ambivalence that takes place in the person who has a disorder of probably of any kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Once you've passed the denial and you realize there is a problem and you might even want to really get well, there is a real a tearing inside of you. Certainly we've heard the verse that says, why do I do the things that I don't want to do, and the things that I do want to do, I can't seem to do them.
Right.
It's that classic struggle that all of us go through in one form or fashion.
Okay, so, we have the victim sitting out here on a very tenuous line, possibly between life and death.
Mm-hmm.
Let me use your situation because it's one you're obviously familiar with.
Right.
I mean, there you were, I think at your, 80 pounds? Something
80
like
pounds
that at your lowest?
At my lowest, right.
And you had this loving husband standing there watching you starve yourself to death. Mm-hmm. And so he hospitalized you. Or
right.
did you hospitalize yourself?
Well, I was very begrudging about it, but I realized at that point that there was very little other recourse left because we had tried, so many other options. And so I kind of went dragging my heels, but really all I was hospitalized for at that point was not treatment, but rather for diagnostic testing, because I still wasn't letting people know exactly what I was doing behind closed doors. And so I went along with being hospitalized, even though I didn't want to, because I felt that the control that I had over my situation was going to be either removed or drastically reduced. And so I went along with it, but only because I knew that they were simply going to be doing tests trying to find what was causing my physical problems. They weren't going to be treating me for what I really knew was the underlying problem, which was the eating disorder.
At that point, did you want help?
Yes, I did. I was tired of being sick, but I was also scared to death of getting well because I didn't know what that meant. I knew what being thin was. I knew what controlling my life through this obsessive-compulsive problem was like, but I didn't know what life on the other side of it would be like, and I was terrified because this disorder had been the only sense of control, really, that I had in my life. So much of my life was, determined for me. We were performing as a family. We were traveling a lot. Then when I was married, I was suddenly not only Pat Boone's daughter, I was now Dan O'Neill's wife, and struggling with trying to figure out what that meant. And I had never really uncovered who Cherry was. I had never allowed myself the luxury of creating an identity of my own. And so to be asked to give up this identity of being anorexic or bulimic and not have anything to replace it with is extremely frightening. It's like, you're starting to fall off a cliff, so you grab for the one remaining branch, and you're hanging on for dear life, and now somebody's saying, okay, now I want you to let go. I want you to let go of that. Well, unless you're pretty sure that there's some kind of safe landing ahead, you don't really want to let go of that branch. And part of the recovery process is creating a sense of security in the person who's giving up the disorder, that life's going to be okay and better in the long run than it is by hanging on to that disorder. I had only read a magazine article that described what my problem was 4 or 5 years after I had been dealing with it. Mm-hmm. And so now we knew it had a name, but we really didn't have any kind of, any kind of positive input as to what to do about it. And so it was while I was hospitalized that we, actually Dan researched what was available and came upon the name of a doctor in the Northwest, in the Seattle area, a psychiatrist who had treated this kind of thing before and had had some success with it. And we had a connection with him through family. Dan's uncle was the pastor of this psychiatrist's church. And so Dan called him up and asked him if he'd be willing to take on our case. And he said that if we were willing to move up to the Northwest and to commit ourselves indefinitely to the period of time that would be required for therapy, that he would gladly take us on. So, talk about walking out on a limb. Dan quit his job. I had to cancel contracts performing with my family, and we packed up everything we had and moved up to the Northwest without any kind of hope of, we certainly didn't have any job waiting for us or any means of income or anything like that. All we had was this hope that somehow this doctor who said he would try and help us would be able to do just that.
You said a very important thing earlier. You said commit to the time that it was going to take.
Exactly.
There is no such thing as a quick fix.
Right, and we talk about that because, so often, particularly the person on the border wants to apply some kind of a quick fix. We live in a society that says instant this, instant that, and there's just no such thing when it comes to a complicated psychological disorder of any kind. You cannot expect an instant cure or an overnight healing. It's not that kind of thing. It requires growth. It requires development. It's going to require time, patience, and, as you said, commitment.
How long did it take for you?
I was so sick of being sick and so ready to really get into the recovery process that I was only in therapy for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't completely well at the end of that 6-month period of time. What happened was we were offered the opportunity to move to Hawaii to live in a Christian community and work there. And in conjunction with the doctor that I was seeing, we decided that this would be a therapeutic environment where I could continue my recovery process. And really, it was a very, very therapeutic place to be. There was not a lot of high pressure. I was allowed to really work on creating this identity of my own, and kind of begin to put into practice in real everyday life the things that I had that I had come to understand in the therapy time. So it was a continuation, really, of the recovery process. So to say that I recovered in 6 months isn't true. I was in therapy for 6 months, but it was a couple of years really of putting those insights into practice before I could say I was really out of the woods.
You had a number of border people
Right.
in your life. You had your family.
Right.
Eventually, you had your husband,
Right.
and then you had your counselor and various other people.
Right.
For people who are on the border right now and maybe listening to this tape and they know that they have either a family member or a friend that's going through something, they're just not too sure what to do, what's a good first step to take?
The first thing we try to tell people is, not to panic. That's the tendency. Once you find out that someone you love has a serious problem, very often the first response is, oh my gosh, what am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that's totally unproductive. The second thing is you've got to try and realize that you cannot change the other person. You cannot control them. You can't make them think a certain way. You can't heal them. You can't cure them. All you can really do is be a loving, supportive, nurturing border person. And when I say all that you can do, that's an awful lot. It's just a scientific fact that people who have a supportive network of caring others have a much better prognosis of recovering from any kind of a disorder like this. I think that's one of the values of support groups.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got family and friends that are automatically part of a natural support group simply by virtue of the relationship that they already have with you, if they can learn to be supportive rather than judgmental or distancing themselves because they're frustrated or whatever, that the person with the disorder has a much greater chance of recovering. And so I would say, try to convey your concern for that person. Sometimes an intervention might be necessary if that person is still denying that they have a problem, much as we've heard take place in the lives of people who have problems with drugs or alcohol. But, it has to be done very carefully and in a non-judgmental way. You have to let that person know the impact that they have on your life without trying to, convey judgment. And then trying to get to some kind of professional help. You should not allow yourself to be manipulated by the other person. If they are not going to go for help, there are support groups and there's help even for people who don't have the disorder but are living with someone who does and need to be able to share with other people in similar situations what that's like, because it's not easy. That's why they have things like, like the alcoholic. There's Alcoholics Anonymous for the person with the alcohol problem, but there's also support groups for Alateen or the people who are receiving some of the fallout from an alcoholic problem in the life of someone else. So certainly I would recommend that, if people can get a hold of our book, we go into several positive roles that they can play in the life of someone who is dealing with a disorder. And we also describe the negative roles that we often find ourselves playing in our efforts to try and help someone who is ill. So hopefully by writing this book and giving people the benefit of our experience, we're going to help them avoid some of the pitfalls and go directly to the roles that can be more positive and helpful in helping someone recover.
I don't know if you get asked this a lot. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But in your own case, why did you become anorexic? I mean, people would have looked at your life. I really do remember being a kid. Honestly, I remember being a kid and watching you on TV. I can't tell you when it was.
Right.
But there you were, the four of you, and you were all just as cute as you could be. And, you all looked fine to me. It didn't look like any of you had any extra weight on you, TV or no TV.
Yeah.
And you traveled over to the Orient. You went here and you went there. And you lived in Beverly Hills. And what a life.
I know. But you see, disorders are really no respecter of persons. I mean, they can, obsessive compulsive problems they're not going to be, they're not going to pick and choose. It depends on the person. It depends oftentimes, as I mentioned before, on the biochemistry or on the genetics or on that person's response to the stresses and pain of living in a world that's not perfect. And I just happen to be the type of personality, along with some, biochemical predisposition, that responded to what was going on in my life, not through taking drugs or by getting hooked on alcohol or, any of the other types of kind of secret sins that are no-nos in the church, but rather I got hooked on dieting, because after all, everybody wants to be thin.
That's right.
That was something that I could do, and boy, I could do it better than anybody else. And being the perfectionist that I was, I was receiving praise for my ability to control my weight and be thin. It's just that in my attempts to try and control an area of my life, it got out of control and ultimately turned around and took control of me. And so, you can have all of the trappings of a successful life, but if you are not being fulfilled internally, if you're not being able to deal with the stresses of life, and certainly there are in any walk of life, in a healthy way, then you're going to come up with ways to deal with that stress and that pain any way you can. And sometimes we find ourselves creating a situation for ourselves that ends up being ultimately self-destructive, and that's what happened with me.
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn the cassette over at this point for the continuation of the message on Side 2.
Your family obviously got a very fast education in eating disorders and something that wasn't well known. How did this affect, not only your mother and your father, but you had 3 younger sisters.
Right.
Who were, basically watching you starve yourself to death.
Well, to say we got a fast education in eating disorders is probably not completely accurate, because it was a long period of time, and we really didn't know what we were dealing with.
You had no idea there, other than maybe knowing there was a problem because you were too thin for good health.
Well, they knew I was dieting, they knew I was exercising, and ultimately they knew that I was binging and purging. But we didn't know why. We didn't know that this had a name. We didn't know that there was anybody else in the world going through anything similar to what I was dealing with. We didn't know that it was going to require some kind of psychological input. Everybody was approaching it pretty much purely as a behavioral problem.
You were being stubborn.
Right, exactly.
Or rebellious or defiant.
Right, exactly. And then here I was at a point when I wanted to get well, and I wasn't trying to be rebellious or stubborn, and yet it was beyond my ability to really control at that point. And so then horrible guilt and self-hatred began to set in, and that just compounds the problem. And certainly the impact it had on my family was great. My sisters, my parents, they didn't understand what was going on, neither did I. But, if you look at it as a behavioral problem, then, you're pretty much going to go through the emotions of, well, why don't they just stop this? It's devastating to the family. It's disruptive. They get angry. They think I'm being selfish. They're frustrated. They realize there's not much they can do. And then, certainly on the part of my sisters, not really my parents, there was kind of a withdrawal, I think. It was like, I can't deal with this, and she's obviously not dealing with it, so I'm just going to, stay away.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, when we all began to understand the problem better, and everybody, including myself, realized that this was in many ways beyond my ability to completely control, there was a greater understanding, and then they became more empathetic and more supportive, and now certainly the relationships that I have with my family, my parents and my sisters, are wonderful. They're very, I think, very healthy, good, solid relationships that have weathered a storm that could have really destroyed the relationships, but I think, love covers a multitude of sins, as they say.
Right. I think there are a lot of disorders. I think probably the scariest one for me is anorexia, because let's face it, diet is one of those words that most of us use on a daily basis.
Oh, sure.
Whether or not we're on a diet, we're watching our cholesterol, we're talking about having a good diet, and dieting in itself has become a way of life.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody's dieting for some purpose or another nowadays.
Right.
I recently heard, and it was a real eye-opener. I recently heard a young girl, she must have been about 6 years old, and was in the grocery store, and she had turned to her mother and said, "I think I need Slim Fast."
Oh, God.
And I thought,
isn't it just, it's like holding a mirror up to the society we're living in. It's like, look, folks, look what we're doing to the most innocent and fragile of our citizens, our 5, 6, 7-year-old kids. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that she was 6 years old and she even knew what Slim Fast was, made a statement to me that she's probably watching too much TV.
Well,
anyway.
That's definitely part of it. The media input is very powerful, and I think that definitely plays a role in the development of eating disorders in the lives of many young women. There's this idea that to be happy and to be valuable, you must be thin, and that's a terribly unfortunate thing to load on, especially vulnerable, sensitive young people that are dealing with with their self-esteem and their sense of identity, and it's very delicate at that point. It's devastating, and we see the results in the increasing numbers of eating disorders.
So you're a parent now,
right?
And I'm sure I think you would have to be really sensitive to this area.
Oh,
Are
yes.
you?
Oh, definitely.
So what are you going to tell parents out there? I've got this 8-year-old child, and maybe she is carrying an extra 5 or 10 pounds. Do I do something about it? Do I ignore it? Do I let her diet? Do I worry if she starts dieting now that she's going to become anorexic by the time she's 13? What do I do?
Well, first of all, I don't think children have any business dieting. They can maybe become more active. You could encourage an involvement in, maybe a soccer team or tennis lessons or something like that. But there's no good reason for a child to diet. In fact, they're finding now that dieting is totally counterproductive anyway. That dieting actually ends up most often causing people to gain weight over the long term, because when you diet, you are depriving your body of caloric input to the point where your body finally says, I'm not getting enough, so I'm going to slows down to protect us from starvation. We're not getting as much as we're used to, so we're going to burn it up slower. Then when the person goes off the diet and the metabolism has slowed, there you are again. You've gained the weight, not only the weight that you lost, but you've put on more weight because your metabolism has adjusted to the deprivation. So to diet is counterproductive in the long run, I believe, anyway. I think the healthiest thing to do is to eat eat healthfully and maybe increase the activity level. And certainly in children, one thing that you really have to concentrate on is building that child's self-esteem so that they are not developing this idea of who they are based on what they look like, what kind of grades they get, how well they do in anything, whether it be sports or whatever. They have to learn to feel good about themselves because of who they are on the inside. And I think that's one of the greatest and most important tasks a parent can have in raising a child.
When you went through all the therapy, when you came out on the other side, let's say, of this disorder, did you have a relapse?
Oh, certainly. I think, one thing that people have to realize as they commit themselves to the recovery process is that setbacks are part of that process. There are going to be relapses along the way, and you have to be prepared for that, because I think if you set yourself up for this idea, well, okay, I'm going to recover, I'm on the road to recovery, I have decided that I'm not going to be bulimic anymore, or I'm not going to be anorexic anymore, or I'm not going to take another drink. You're really being unrealistic to think that, you've had this huge problem in your life that's controlled your life for months, maybe years, and now it's going to go away completely, once and for all, with no problems. That's terribly unrealistic. It's much more realistic and much healthier for the person to realize that there's going to be temptations, there's going to be struggles, there might be times when they fall, but that's part of the process. You can learn from it rather than becoming completely overwhelmed and devastated and destroyed by the fact that you've blown it. You ask yourself, now, what caused that? What was the thing that set me off? How can I learn from this? You get back up and you keep going. Because as long as you're committed to that recovery and your eye is on that goal of getting to the other side, if you take things one step at a time, one day at a time, rather than trying to tackle it all at once, you're going to find yourself eventually so far down the road that you're going to turn around and see, wow, I've made it. And that the fact that setbacks or relapses happen along the way is not something that we should necessarily fear, or certainly not be down on ourselves for, but we can learn from those things. We can figure out what caused them, what set them up, and we can learn from them. And if we're expecting them, they're not going to destroy us.
If you're a drug abuser or an alcohol abuser, I can see, going through treatment, and coming away from that, and knowing that you have to come to a point where you really no longer use alcohol,
right,
and you stay away from drugs,
right.
You
can't do that with
food. You can't do that with food. Yeah.
That's the problem.
You can't do that with food.
You cannot abstain totally from food.
And really and truly, although I hate the word diet, you can't really abstain from some sort of a regimented food plan. I mean, everybody tries to cut down before the holidays. Everybody is kind of, you're there. That's always in the back of your mind. What am I eating? Or sometimes it is.
Mm-hmm.
And does that worry you? I mean, did that worry the people around you? If they ever saw you trying to cut back on food intake, did they automatically think, oh my gosh, what's wrong with Cherry?
Oh yeah. And that was one of the difficult parts of recovery for me, was the fact that people would watch me like a hawk.
I bet.
And I had to realize, look, part of my problem, part of what caused me to become anorexic, was trying to please everyone all the time. I was the classic people pleaser. I was a perfectionist. My identity, my value as a person came pretty much from the acceptance and the approval that I felt from other people. That's why I wanted to be thin in the first place. And so I had to realize that if I was going to be a completely recovered individual, I had to get past that point where I was worried about what other people thought. And I had to just be true to myself. If I was full and I didn't want to finish a meal, that was fine. If I didn't want to eat certain kinds of foods, that was fine. As long as I knew that I was being healthy and that I was getting enough, that was all I needed to worry about. And
did you ever worry?
If other people had their suspicions, then I would just have to allow that and let them see over the long haul that I was okay. And that was not an easy an easy thing to do, especially when perhaps, one of those people who might be watching me was my husband, who I live with 24 hours a day.
Right.
You have to get to the point where you're strong enough in yourself to know that you're okay, and eventually everybody else is going to realize that too.
Did you ever worry about yourself? I mean, did you ever, how you sit around and you think, well, maybe I'm doing this for a deeper reason or a deeper cause. You get to the point that you start thinking about it so much, did you ever worry that maybe you were going to slip back?
Not once I was really recovered, no. I think, having effectively dealt with the underlying root causes of my problem, getting to the psychological and emotional basis for it all, and then not only confronting those issues but resolving them, I wasn't so much afraid of a relapse. There were things that kind of took me by surprise. For example, after I had been recovered for a while, I gave birth to my second child, and I had a major postpartum depression that I wasn't expecting. I didn't realize that because depression had been a factor in my eating disorder, that was going to necessarily be a problem that would come up again. Even though the eating disorder behavior had been dealt with, the tendency towards depression was something that was going to return from time to time. And so that was something that I had to deal with, and that was a very difficult period of time because I felt very guilty because I was taking out my depression and my emotions on my first child, who was 2, and my husband, and I was kind of an emotional roller coaster, and I felt very guilty about that. But, I had a 2-month premature child who was colicky and a 2-year-old, and I was completely stressed out, and then add to that the fact that I had this biochemically based depression that went undiagnosed for 6 or 7 months before I finally realized that something was wrong. When I went back to the doctor that had helped me with the anorexia, and he diagnosed the depression and put me on an antidepressant medication, I felt like I was back to normal in about a week. And that the guilt that I had felt from having felt so out of control and felt like my daughter and my husband were receiving the fallout from this, a lot of that guilt was alleviated because, once again, I realized this was not something that I really had control over. Now that I had the information and I had the wherewithal to be able to deal with the depression, I had a certain amount of responsibility to do that. But, that was something that I had to deal with, and I've had to realize that might be something that comes up from time to time in my life because that is a biochemically based problem that is obviously something I inherited as a genetic predisposition. So, the disorder itself has been dealt with, but some of the components of it kind of took me by surprise, and I had to deal with them later on after the eating disorder itself had been effectively dealt with.
You said something, and I'm sure you get a reaction out of this, or I would think you would get a reaction out of this, depending on who you're talking in front of. Antidepressants. You took drugs. And we have a lot of people let's face it, we have a lot of people in the church who can't even accept Christian counselors, much less, like you said earlier, anything that starts with the word psych. And good heavens, they had you take a drug.
Right.
That's really still tough for a lot of people.
I know it is, and it's terribly unfortunate because we don't think anything about someone who's diabetic taking their insulin every day. And yet the problems are similar. If the body is not creating the chemicals needed for proper function, there is absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, there's everything right about providing the body with what it needs to be able to function normally. And, just because some people need medication to help them think right,
mm-hmm.
That shouldn't be something we hold against them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, we certainly don't hold it against a diabetic that they have to take insulin. So why should we hold it against someone who has a genetically inherited predisposition towards depression? Why should we hold it against them to have to take a medication that's going to help them function normally and be happy, healthy individuals? It's simply providing the body with something it's not making on its own.
Do you think because of the reaction of the church to most forms of therapy, to most forms of any kind of medical help in this area, that a Christian who might be anorexic or bulimic is much more likely to not want to admit it, and possibly more likely to suffer far more damage?
Well, I think it might take them longer to come to the point where they're willing to ask for help, and ultimately that can create more damage, because the longer it goes undiagnosed, the more damage can be done, and the harder it is really to recover, because the more deeply entrenched that person becomes in that disordered way of life and disordered thinking. So, yeah, I would say that probably is the case. And it's unfortunate, because the church should be full of loving, supportive people who accept a person who has a problem, much like, certainly Jesus didn't condemn people who were caught in the traps of sinful lives or lives that were filled with problems that were beyond their control. He said, I don't condemn you. Just go and take care of the problem. And that should be our response, not condemnation or judgment.
Support groups, you're all in favor of them.
Well, I would say you would probably have to carefully choose the support group that you're a part of, but I agree with the concept, certainly. The idea that we can be a support to one another. For example, my father had the experience of being able to go to a cancer research center many years ago, and a scientist gave him the opportunity to look in a microscope and show him what a cancer cell looks like. And he said it was this black, awful, blobby, misshapen thing. He said it just looked like evil personified. And then he saw another slide under the microscope, and the doctor told him, this is the one surefire known cure for cancer. And he looked at under the microscope, and it was a white blood cell, a lymphocyte. Our own body makes the most powerful opponent, that can battle cancer. Unfortunately, when a person has cancer, their body is often not producing enough of those to win the war. But the human lymphocyte is what can have victory over cancer. And so then the doctor told my dad to look in the microscope one more time, and he showed him a cancer cell under the microscope and introduced several lymphocytes with this cancer cell. And my dad said that what he saw was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. He saw these little white discs, these little round circles, these little lymphocytes. He said they just looked like little halos, They were just beautiful little peaceful-looking white discs. They floated towards this awful-looking black cancer cell and surrounded it, and it just dissolved. He said it was as if they loved it to death. And when you think of support groups or a supportive network of people around someone who has an obsessive-compulsive disorder of any kind or addictive behavior, we can be like those lymphocytes. We can surround that person, and we can love that person's problem to death. Not the person, but that person's problem. And I think that's a real graphic example of what real support is all about.
You are undoubtedly one of the lucky ones.
Oh, definitely.
You made it through this. You made it through this with your family intact.
Right, and now with a problem like anorexia, for many years I didn't think I'd ever be able to have children. My reproductive system had shut down for over 7 years. There were signs of atrophy of the organs. Now, 11 weeks ago, gave birth to my 5th child.
Oh, my. Congratulations.
So to be able to say not only have I recovered and have been able to be responsible for my own life, but now that I have been blessed with 5 other little lives that I have been able to give birth to and been able to nurse and sustain their health, that's really a continuation of the miracle for me.
You've been in contact with other people who have suffered from bulimia and anorexia. As a matter of fact, you were in contact with Karen Carpenter prior to her death.
Yes, I was, and that's really an awfully sad chapter in, I think, American life. I believe that her death was a tragedy that could have been avoided. She had set a time limit on her recovery process. She wanted to be well by a certain time. She had contacted me when she was finally ready to do something about her problem, and asked me what my advice was, and I really urged her to get out of LA, to get away from the pressures of that environment, to get into therapy. And I really wanted her to come up into the same environment that I had come up to, and even see my doctor. But she chose a doctor in New York, and unfortunately New York is not the most peaceful place to go to from LA, but
Right.
at least she was changing her environment. She was taking control of the situation. She was getting out. She was seeing a specialist. But she had in her mind that she wanted to be well by a certain time. And you can't set a time limit on recovery. You have to be open-ended about it. And she ended up terminating her therapy too soon. She put herself back in the LA environment. She was back in the studio, beginning to work on some projects again. And I think, her heart had sustained some damage from the starvation. And she just really wasn't ready to face it again. And her heart couldn't handle the abuse and the pressure, and unfortunately we know the rest of the story.
Mm-hmm. You must have been devastated when you heard the news.
Yeah, I had some mixed reactions. I mean, obviously I was in shock. I felt horrible for her and for her family, and for all of us, because we all loved her and her contribution to the music world, and we love her voice, which we can still hear today, on the records that she
Mm-hmm.
made. But I also had the reaction of being extremely grateful that my story had not
Mm-hmm.
ended the same way. And to this day, I'll be in the grocery store rushing up and down the aisles trying to get my grocery shopping done so that I can get on to the next task, being the mother of this many kids.
Mother of 5 kids, yes.
And I'll have, maybe a fussy infant or a difficult toddler with me or something, and suddenly I'll hear Karen Carpenter's voice over the Muzak, and it puts everything in perspective, and I realize how lucky I am.
What suggestions, as we're getting ready to end here, what would you tell a family or a young person who knows that she's anorexic or bulimic, or the family of that young person? What suggestions, what help do you have to give them?
Well, if the person who has the disorder is really ready to try and get well, I would say ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for help. If you realize that a problem is bigger than you are, it's actually a sign of strength to be able to ask for help. So I would strongly encourage that person to seek out some kind of professional help. For the loved ones, try to determine and adopt the positive roles that you can play in that other person's recovery process. Try to avoid the pitfalls of the negative roles, the attempts at quick fixes or control, or taking the reins in your own hands and forcing a recovery, because it just doesn't work. Taking on the role of being a nurturing, supportive, loving part of the support network is the best thing you can do. Do not allow yourself to be manipulated by the person who has the disorder, because ultimately that puts you more in a kind of a codependent status. But I guess the main thing is not to lose hope, because recovery is possible, and the more supportive you are of that person, not their problem, but of the person, the better the prognosis, and recovery for everyone is possible. And I think one of the unknown positive side effects of coming through something like this is that everybody learns about their own problems and their own issues, and I think everybody comes out better in the long run for having gone through something like this and gotten in touch with problems they might not ever have resolved had these issues not come up, in albeit a painful setting. But certainly I think we can all learn and grow from them, and you can live on the border of someone's disorder, but you can all benefit from the recovery process.
Thank you very much, Cherry Boone O'Neill. The name of the book, Living on the Border of Disorder. She wrote it with her husband, Dan O'Neill. Along with families who may have this situation going on in their home, I highly suggest that youth pastors, local church pastors, everyone go to your local bookstore and get a copy of this. The church needs to open their eyes a little to this situation. learn to be a little more forgiving, learn to be a little more compassionate, learn to be a little more aware, especially in our young people's life, of what's going on in their life, problems that may be forming that we may not have a certain grasp on, and how to deal with those. And Cherry, I want to thank you for being my guest today.
Well, thank you for having me.
This is the end of the message. For further information regarding other topics available on cassette and in printed form, write Compassion Connection, Box 36C, Denver, Colorado, 80236.